Alright, today we're going to be reacting to Making Toilet Paper Moonshine by NileRed. I was scrolling through Nile's videos, looking for stuff to react to, and this was the one I decided to put at the top of the list, just because of how ridiculous it sounds. But he does have a lot of ridiculous videos, so, you know. Like here, we have turning paint thinner into cherry soda. So, like, you know, yeah, he has a lot of stuff. I know there's also the Nile Blue channel that he has. I don't really know the difference between the two. But before we start the video, make sure you go check out the original in the description, as well as NileRed. He does a lot of sciencey stuff, a lot of cool stuff. So I'm excited to watch this. And let's go ahead and get started. Warning. Making or distilling alcohol can be illegal without the proper permits or licenses. Please do not recreate what I do. Okay.
So for this video, I'm going to be doing exactly what the title says, and I'm going to be turning toilet paper into drinkable alcohol. I don't know exactly where this idea came from, but about 6 months ago, I became convinced that this conversion was possible. This is because toilet paper, and well, pretty much all paper, is made almost entirely of cellulose. Cellulose naturally occurs in almost all plants.
Oh
and
yeah,
use
that
it to
makes
make
sense.
Everything from cotton clothing to paper or cardboard. What I've always found interesting, though, is that at the core of it, it's just a chain of simple glucose sugar molecules. Sugar is something that we usually associate with food,
because
but
like
in cellulose,
chlorophyll
the glucose
and all
units
that.
have been strung together in a very specific way, which gives it completely different properties.
Okay, this is a little beyond my understanding, but you know, we're gonna roll with it.
This has always blown my mind because it means that our clothing and almost all paper is basically made out of sugar, and wood is also about 50% cellulose, so a lot of our houses are also kind of made out of sugar. For the most part, though, cellulose is very resistant to degradation.
Never thought about it like that.
Is mostly inaccessible.
But I mean, I guess it makes sense because, like, you know, that's how plants make energy, sugar, from sunlight.
However, the fact that some animals and microbes have developed ways to break it back down into glucose told me that there had to be a way that I could do it. Based on this, my dream was to start with a cellulose source like toilet paper and then somehow chop it up to make a solution of glucose. Into that, I could then throw in some brewer's yeast to turn it into alcohol, and then I could distill it to make some weird toilet paper moonshine. The biggest challenge of this project was, of course, the first part, which was breaking down the cellulose. To do this, there were two main ways, either chemically or enzymatically, and both of them had their own pros and cons. The chemical method was more efficient, but it involved using a lot of acid, which would be hard to separate from the sugar after it was done. I would have most likely ended up having to neutralize all the acid, and I figured that this would both be wasteful and kind of messy. The enzyme method, on the other hand, appeared to be less efficient and even take longer, but from what I could tell, it was a lot cleaner and much easier to set up. After thinking about it for a good while, I felt that I liked the enzymatic way.
I think I understand what he's trying to do, but I'm not 100% sure.
Better, so the next thing that I had to do was buy some enzyme. The enzyme that I needed to break down the cellulose was called cellulase, and the cheapest source of it that I could find was from a company called the Alchemist's Pantry. They were a brewing company, and it was all supposed to be food-grade stuff, so it was almost perfect, and I bought a bag of it.
I guess if, you know, if it's food grade, it's not too weird to have that on eBay. But, you know, it's still a little apprehensive about buying that kind of stuff from eBay.
Clearly stated that all the cellulase came from yeast and not bacteria, and I'll explain.
Oh, I saw, sorry for pausing so much, I saw in the description that he said a correction, this is not actually a strain of yeast, it is a type of fungi.
Why this was important later on. But anyway, the enzyme was being shipped from Europe, and it was going to take a few weeks to arrive. So, while I was waiting for it, I figured that it was a good time to actually put together the process that I was going to be doing. It honestly took me a while to figure it all out.
Yeah, I can imagine.
After a bunch of research, I eventually came up with something that was relatively simple. To do it, all I needed was some basic equipment and a few easy-to-get chemicals. When the
Okay.
enzyme eventually arrived,
Let
I considered doing some
me see if I can. Space treatment is cellulase, 50 degrees Celsius for 48 hours with a pH of 5. Then move that to with the brewer's yeast, 30 Celsius for 14 days. A pH of 5. Okay. I think I'm getting it.
When the enzyme eventually arrived, I considered doing some small-scale tests to verify that what I came up with worked, but it was such a simple process that I decided to just wing it and go all in.
Ah, okay, yes.
If it ended up working, it would save me a
Wing
lot
it,
of time,
the scientist
and I figured
special.
that at worst, I'd have a bunch of sad failure footage that could be used for something. So now, to get started, the first thing that I needed was some toilet paper. I'm pretty sure that almost any brand would have worked, but I specifically went with the one with the fluffy kittens on it.
As you should.
Toilet paper is one of the least densely packed forms of paper, which means that it has a lot of potential surface area for enzymes to attack it.
Ah, okay.
However, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier for enzymes to break it down.
Oh.
At the molecular level, the cellulose fibers are still tightly packed together, and it's hard for cellulase to do anything. If I just directly mixed the enzyme with the toilet paper, not very much would happen, and it would probably make little to no sugar. To fix this problem, though, it wasn't very hard, and I just...
Okay, so... I'm trying to make sense of what he's doing here. So... he's going to put the toilet paper into the cellulase, which will then break down the glucose or something, which will make sugar. And then he'll use that sugar solution or whatever to add yeast to it and make the alcohol. Right? I think that's what he's doing. If I understood it right.
just had to pre-treat the cellulose with a dilute base. So, I got out a large pot, and into it, I added 3 liters of distilled water, followed by 60 grams of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner.
Hey, why the...
This would give me roughly a 2% base solution, and I stirred it until everything dissolved.
Oh, okay, making it like...
Then,
making it
I slowly
more
added
basic,
one
I guess?
entire roll, and as you would expect with
pH?
toilet paper, it quickly started soaking it up. After about 10 seconds, it was completely full of water, and I tried to break it up as much as I could. I also pulled out the cardboard tube from the center, because I wanted to keep this purely just toilet paper.
There's something really weird about it. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's the fact that he's just mushing up toilet paper? I don't know.
I was eventually left with a nice and mushy toilet paper stew.
Very
and
nice.
The next thing to do was to basically cook it. To do this, I just put it onto a cheap IKEA induction heater, and I cranked up the power. It all slowly heated up, and when it
yes,
eventually
some
got to a
boiled
boil,
toilet
I
paper
turned down
goo.
the power to keep it at a light
Very
simmer.
nice.
I tried stirring it often to prevent it from splashing, but it didn't really seem to help. It apparently just loves splattering boiling hot water everywhere, and I found that
Nice.
putting on the lid was absolutely necessary. The goal here was to try to keep it under control and to have it simmer for about
Ooh,
an
it's
hour
like
and a half.
turning
Under these conditions,
brown?
the cellulose fibers were being attacked by the base and getting partially degraded.
Okay.
This caused a lot of the bonds between the fibers to be broken, which allowed them to separate and become less densely packed. It was also
okay, I
chopping
think...
up the
So he's using the base solution to kind of break up the bonds a little bit. And then next, he'll use the cellulose to completely, like, poof, you know? Am I understanding that right? I think so. I don't know.
cellulose fibers into smaller pieces, and their average length was going down a lot. This created more shorter length fibers, and this was important because it meant that there were more open ends.
Okay.
The cellulase enzyme can only degrade the fiber from the end, and by making more potential areas of attack, it should make it go a lot faster.
Alright, I see. Yeah,
In summary,
kind of
though,
what I was
the
saying.
major effect of this base treatment was that it was separating the fibers and chopping them up. By the time it was done, the whole thing had turned yellow, and it had a very distinct smell to it. I honestly thought that it was going to be horrible, but it was surprisingly pleasant.
Really?
I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it was kind of sweet and woody. I took it off the heater and I let it cool for
I guess
about
that makes
30
sense.
minutes, and when it wasn't crazy hot anymore, I filtered off all the paper.
Oh god.
What I was left with in the strainer looked a lot like some bad mashed potatoes.
Yeah, I was just about to say, it looks like mashed potatoes. Take a bite of that. Take a bite.
In the container below it was all the water, and without the paper, it had a much darker orange-brown color. What I had to do now was wash it with a lot of distilled water to get rid of the base and as much of the color as possible. I tried doing this a couple times directly in the strainer, but it just wasn't very efficient, and most of the paper barely got washed. So what I did instead was clean the pot from before and dump everything back into it.
Okay, we're just gonna boil off the... Oh, that really looks like mashed potatoes.
A lot more water, and I was able to thoroughly mix around the paper to make sure that it all got washed.
Nice.
This was then poured back into the strainer, and after doing it just once, it was already looking pretty good. I ended up doing this one more time, and then I just did several crappier washes directly in the strainer. When I eventually felt that it was good enough, I tried squeezing out as much of the water as I could. At this point though, the container was quite full with water already, and it was hitting the bottom of the strainer. So, I just continued doing it over the pot, and this was what I was eventually left with. This pre-treated paper was now good to go, but I wasn't quite ready to get things started, and I still had to make the enzyme solution. To do this, I first had to make an enzyme concentrate by adding 90 grams of the enzyme powder that I got earlier, and then bringing it up to about 400 mils using distilled water. I then stirred it around, but a lot of it didn't want to dissolve because most of this enzyme powder was just filler. It's pretty common for enzymes to be dispersed on inert fillers, and in this case, the fillers were cornstarch and maltodextrin. The cellulase enzyme itself and most of the maltodextrin dissolved into the water, but the cornstarch was pretty much insoluble. When I was planning this project, I was a bit concerned because both cornstarch and maltodextrin are also glucose-based sugars. I was worried that they might also end up getting broken down into glucose and turned into ethanol, but this actually isn't an issue. They don't get attacked by the cellulase, and the yeast in the fermentation step that I'll be doing later aren't able to break them down either.
Why is that?
I even confirmed this by doing a separate control run, but I'll talk about that later in the video.
Okay.
Because these fillers were inert, I could have just directly used this mixture as it was, but I wanted to clean it up a bit and to get rid of the cornstarch. Filtering cornstarch, though, is almost always a nightmare, and instead, I just covered the top and I let it sit in my fridge overnight. By the next morning, it had pretty much all separated, and this enzyme concentrate was now good to go. To make the actual enzyme
in one of my old science classes in middle school, we did this with mud that we got from our backyard. That was one of our projects. Yep.
Though, I had to dilute this concentrate in something known as a buffer solution. A buffer solution is something that's commonly used when working with enzymes, and it helps keep the pH at a specific level.
Oh, okay.
This is important because enzymes are very sensitive to pH, and they work most efficiently in a certain range. The cellulase that I had was from yeast, and the optimal pH for it was 5, so that was what I had to make the buffer at. There are many different chemicals that can be used to make a buffer, but a very easy and common method is to use citric acid and sodium citrate.
Okay.
Both of these are common food additives, and I was able to easily find them at a local store. I also found a calculator for making this buffer online, and all I had to do was plug in the pH that I wanted, the concentration, and the total volume that I was going for. Based on my research, a total of 3 liters seemed ideal, with a pH of 5 and a molarity of 0.05. After plugging this in, it told me to use about 25 grams of the sodium citrate and 12.2 grams of the citric acid. So, into a large mason jar, I added 2.6 liters of distilled water, followed by the citric acid and the sodium citrate.
Okay.
I stirred it around until it all dissolved. And into this,
there's something really satisfying about how clear that water is. I don't know why. It's just normal water.
The enzyme concentrate from before, which brought it up to 3 liters.
Okay.
I tried to leave as much of the cornstarch as I could in the beaker, but some of it was still able to make it in. Now after all this, the enzyme solution was finally ready, and all I had to do was add the toilet paper.
Alright. So this is the solution that's gonna break down the cellulose?
When it was all in there, I mixed it around as thoroughly as I could, and I loosely covered the top.
Good soup.
I then took this whole thing and I put it into an oven that was set just slightly above 50°C.
It looks like milk. Give me a drink.
This was the optimal temperature that this cellulase worked at, and I had to leave it in there for 2 days. Over this time,
Okay.
the enzyme should be attacking the cellulose
Right.
and slowly turning it into glucose. When it comes to cellulase, though, it usually isn't just one enzyme doing everything, and it's actually a group of a few different ones, all working together. The first one is endocellulase, and it breaks the bonds between the fibers and within the
Okay.
fibers themselves. By pre-treating the paper with a base, though, a lot of these bonds were already broken,
Yeah,
and the ones
yeah,
that
yeah.
remained were a lot easier to access. The liberated fibers were then attacked by the exocellulase, which degrades them from their ends. So what it does is bind to the
Gotcha.
end and travel along the fiber and chop off groups of 2 or 4 glucose units. These much smaller sugar units are then finally broken down into glucose by another enzyme called cellobiase. When I checked on it the next day, the paper had all floated to the top.
Oh.
I then stirred it, and compared to before, it was definitely a lot thinner and fluffier.
Yeah.
The cellulase had clearly
Like a
done
powder.
something to it, and so far, it was looking a lot better than I expected.
Nice.
I checked on it again about half an hour later, and it had separated, where most of it stayed floating. The stuff at the top was slowly falling down, though, and over the course of the day, most of it ended up at the bottom. I left it
Forbidden
until the next
snow.
day, until it hit the 48-hour mark, and this was what I had.
So is
There was
that
still a bunch of stuff left over, but
like
it didn't
sugar
at all
water?
resemble the toilet paper that I started with.
Yeah, it's like like a powder now.
It was done at this point, so I took it out of the oven, but before moving on, I had to let it cool down. It was currently somewhere just above 50°C, but I needed it to be closer to 35. This was going to take about an hour though, and in the meantime, I poked around at it a bit. I was honestly really
As you do.
impressed with how fine and fluffy it was, and like I said before, I really didn't expect it to work this well. I'm really
that's
not
cool
sure
looking.
exactly how much paper was still left here, but I feel like it was probably around 10 to 20% of what I started with. However, that's almost just entirely speculation on my part, and not really based on much. When it eventually got to 35°C, it was time to add the yeast. When it comes to
we're adding the
fermenting
yeast.
sugar to make alcohol, there are a lot of different yeast strains to choose from, and each of them have their own pros and cons.
Okay.
However, in my case, I wasn't doing anything very fancy.
It's like
so
a
I just
snow
went with common
globe.
brewer's yeast, which can tolerate many conditions. These conditions, though, at least in terms of pH, were actually kind of ideal. As I mentioned earlier, the cellulase that I was using originally came from yeast, so the pH was already tuned to be optimal for yeast. This
Oh,
was why I
nice.
didn't want to use a bacterial cellulase, because then I would have had to readjust the pH. The yeast in the packet was
Okay.
dehydrated, and right now, they were all getting rehydrated and coming back to life. I then snapped on the plastic adapter that the jar came with, followed by the lid that I had modified. I had cut a hole in it to fit a stopper and an airlock, so that I
Right,
could
I've
prevent
seen this
air from
before.
getting in, and to also help track
From where?
the
Don't ask.
progress of the fermentation. Initially, not much appeared to be happening, but then, very quickly, a lot of
Hey,
yeast
look at
flakes
that!
started floating to the top. They were being carried by the CO2 gas that they were producing, which gave them some buoyancy. When they got to the top, though, and released the CO2, they would then sink back down. This cycle continued for a while, but it didn't last forever because the yeast were slowly being dispersed into the water. By the next day, it was just a murky-looking mixture, and there were no pieces floating around anymore. It was also generating a lot of CO2, which was
Yeah.
a very good sign because it told me that the yeast were happily eating away at sugar.
Mm-hmm.
How much
And
sugar
producing
was actually
alcohol.
there, though, I had no idea, but it was definitely working, at least to some degree. I then looked at the airlock and it was letting a bubble out about every 30 seconds, which was a pretty decent rate. What I had to do now was basically nothing, and I just had to wait until it completely stopped bubbling. When this eventually happens, it would mean that there was little to no sugar left, and I figured it would take about 2 weeks. I didn't just leave it where it was, though, and I put it in the oven that I used before, and I kept it just above
yeast.
30°C.
Yeah, yeast likes heat. Do the same thing for bread.
This was about a week later, and the amount of paper
Letting
at
the
the
dough
bottom
rise.
had gone down quite a bit. This was because I had never deactivated the cellulase, and it was still slowly attacking the cellulose. It wasn't as efficient because it was around 30°C instead of above 50, but it was still apparently working. In terms of bubbling, it was much slower than before, but it was still clearly going on, so I put it back in the oven, and I waited another week. So I came back a week later, and when I checked on it, the airlock wasn't moving at all, and I couldn't see any
It's going
bubbling
surprisingly
going on.
well.
At the bottom, there was still some white stuff, but I wasn't sure if this was leftover paper or just a bunch of yeast. At this point, I considered it done, and now the next thing that I had to do was distill it to get out the ethanol. I didn't want to include all that questionable stuff at the bottom, though, so I poured everything into another container. The bit that was still
Take a sip of the
was
toilet
then
paper
dumped into a
juice.
coffee filter. This filtration was really slow, and it wasn't really worth waiting for it to finish. The liquid that did eventually pass through, though, would all be added back to the main batch. But anyway, with all that done, I could start setting up the distillation. When most people distill alcohol, they use a large and specialized setup for it, which is the most efficient thing to do. However, I just decided to do it in glassware because my scale was relatively small,
And you're
I thought
only
that it would
doing it
look
once.
nicer. Almost all my glassware had been used before, so to keep this food safe, I bought a fresh set from eBay for about $55 Canadian.
Nice.
The biggest flask that it came with, though, was only 1 liter, so I'd have to distill it in multiple batches. To get things started, I added a stir bar, and then I poured in the alcohol solution. In general, it's best not to go much over the halfway point, but I wanted to get this done in the fewest batches possible, so I ended up pushing it a bit. Above the flask, I put together the rest of the setup, and to do this, I used a fractional column, a thermometer, a condenser, and a beaker.
Right.
I then turned on my water circulator, and I got some cold water flowing through the condenser. At this point, it was good to go, so under the flask, I added a heating mantle, and I turned on the heating and stirring.
Yeah,
As
I
it warmed
remember
up,
using
it
one of
started
these in
bubbling a lot,
science
but it
class.
wasn't boiling, and it was mostly just CO2 gas getting kicked out of solution. The color also shifted to being much whiter, and I think this was caused by yeast coming out of suspension. Some frothing started happening, and it didn't look like it wanted to disappear, and this was going to be a problem. So I turned on the heating to try to prevent a disaster, but it was a bit too late.
You got some bubbles
the foam had
rising in
already
there.
started climbing the column, and it wasn't really slowing down. It was able to make its way all the way to the top of the column, and then suddenly, it started actually boiling, and it launched a bunch of liquid through the entire setup. This was a bit of a pain, but it wasn't the end of the world.
Oh, okay.
It just meant that it was going to take a bit longer, because I now had to recycle everything here in the next batch, and also, I had to be a bit more careful with the heating.
Gotcha.
When it eventually looked like it was under control, I covered the flask and the column with some aluminum foil. This helps insulate them, and it makes it easier for the vapor to climb the column and make it to the condenser. I also swapped the beaker, but the stuff coming over was still pretty murky because it was picking up all the solid junk that was carried up the column before. This run was definitely turning out to be way messier than I expected. I was hoping
Well, I mean,
that this
I did
stuff would
say earlier it was going surprisingly well, so, something had to go wrong.
be nice and clear, but that obviously wasn't the case, and I was going to have to recycle this as well. It wasn't a total loss or anything, though, because the alcohol coming over was definitely a lot more concentrated than it started at. It just didn't look very nice. However, it was still mostly just water, and it had other volatile stuff mixed in as well. To really clean it up and to properly concentrate it, I'd have to do a second or maybe even a third distillation.
Yeah,
The reason that
and
the
probably
stuff
clean
coming
out the
over was mostly
distillation
water
machine.
was because I was only starting with a very low concentration of ethanol. In my fermentation mixture, it was probably at most something like 2% ethanol, and that meant that it was 98% water. At the very beginning, the stuff coming over was probably close to 50 or 60% ethanol, but after that, it quickly and continuously dropped.
Huh.
This happened because as the ethanol was boiled off, that 2% concentration was constantly decreasing and the relative amount of water was constantly increasing. This caused
Okay.
more and more water vapor to be let off with the ethanol, and the stuff that I was receiving eventually became almost entirely water.
Right.
This meant that I couldn't really trust the thermometer because the temperature was heavily skewed to the boiling point of water. However, even though it was well above the boiling point of ethanol, which is around 78°C, there was still some ethanol coming over once it was up at around 98. Usually, temperature is the best thing to go by.
Is it because of
but
all
I couldn't
the
use it here,
solid
I had to
stuff
go
in the
with
water?
more
It's not
traditional
boiling
way.
properly?
So, to know how close it was to being done, I just occasionally tasted what was coming over and tried to tell if there was any ethanol in it. As I said before though, along with the water and ethanol, there's other volatile stuff coming over with it, which doesn't really make it taste very good.
I can imagine.
It wasn't as bad as I expected it would be, but I did end up spitting out most of what I tried. At some point, I couldn't taste any more ethanol in it,
Looking
and
pretty
then I
clear.
continued collecting it for several more minutes. After this, I considered it done, and pretty much all of the ethanol should have been extracted. Everything left in the boiling flask was just waste, and after letting it cool for a bit, I poured it down the drain. This was
Okay,
one of
nice.
the rare times where it's okay for me to do this, because unlike a lot of the chemistry that I often do, there was nothing toxic or dangerous in this. This was everything that I'd collected,
Yeah, don't
which was not very
pour
pretty to say the
random
least,
chemicals down the
and
drain.
like I said
That's a
before,
good idea.
was just going to be recycled. So, I reattached the now empty flask, and I poured them in. I then added more of the other stuff, and I set it all up again. This time,
hopefully
I
we
was
don't
super careful with the heating,
get any
and
bubbling.
there wasn't a disaster. This time, because it was going to be a
Nice.
lot slower, I expected the ethanol coming over to be more concentrated, and I started with just a small vial. However, after a bit, I realized that I was going to be collecting a lot more than this, and I
Hey,
swapped it out for a
nice.
mason jar. Then, just like the other run, I did it until a taste test told me that there wasn't any more alcohol coming over. And when it was done, I emptied the flask, filled it with fresh stuff, and just kept it going. It was all going really well all the way up to the last batch,
Huh.
and everything that I had was nice and clear.
That
However,
is that
for
our
some
moonshine?
reason, it of course decided to go crazy
Oh, never
right
mind.
when I was close to the end, and it spit over
Oh,
a bunch
no.
of that white junk. This wasn't a huge deal though, because I planned to do a second distillation
okay.
anyway,
We're good.
but
We're
it
good.
was still
False alarm.
kind of sad.
Oh,
This whole distillation process was way slower than I expected, and it took me a few days to finish.
oh.
At this point though, it was finally done, so I took away the mason jar and I dumped out all the stuff in the flask. What I had now was less than 10% of the volume that I started with, so it was way more concentrated than before. As a quick test, mostly just for fun, I decided to try lighting it on fire. However, it still wasn't concentrated enough to ignite,
Aw.
and not very much happened. I honestly wasn't very surprised by this though, and now, to actually find out its concentration, I poured it all into a grad cylinder.
Oh, okay.
I then dropped in a hydrometer, which will float at different heights depending on the density of the liquid.
Look, got a bit of
When
toilet
there's
paper
more
in there.
ethanol, the density will be lower, and this meter
Okay, so we're
will
at
be
about
able to
20%
sink
then?
deeper.
Oh, that
In
means
this case, though, it didn't go very deep at all, and it told me that the concentration was around 20%.
Yep. Okay.
This was way higher than I ever imagined getting from this project.
That's still pretty
and
high though.
250 mils of 20% alcohol
Yeah.
really isn't bad at all. I was hoping to maybe get 5 or 10 mils of pure alcohol, but based on this, it's telling me that there's more like 50. But anyway,
Yeah,
at
that's
this
pretty
point,
good.
If all I was looking for was to drink some dirty toilet paper wine, I could have stopped here.
No, we want
However, based on the
moonshine.
taste test that I had to do, this wouldn't be a very pleasant experience. To make it even remotely tolerable, I had to distill it again to get rid of all that solid junk and to purify it. Besides ethanol, there were a lot of other volatile and bad-tasting things in there. When it was super dilute, it was very difficult to get rid of them, but now, with another distillation, I should be able to get rid of almost all of them. This time, I had a lot less liquid, so I could do it in a smaller flask, and all in one batch.
Nice.
I also completely cleaned and scrubbed the rest of the setup
Ah,
to make
perfect.
sure that it was as
That's
clean
what
as possible.
I was thinking you
I
should
then
do.
set it up like before, but this time, the heating mantle was a bit oversized. This was okay though, and it would just make the heating a bit less efficient. However,
Maybe
with
that's a
most
good
of the
thing.
yeast and most of the other stuff gone now, there shouldn't be a problem with bubbling or foaming. At this point, I was just about to get things started, but then I realized that I totally forgot the stir bar. So, I just quickly popped it open again.
How do
and
those
dropped
little
one in,
stir bars
and then
work?
I turned on the heating and
I
stirred.
know they start spinning,
After
but
this,
I
I
don't
covered
know
everything with foil,
why.
and I waited for stuff to start coming over. One major difference between this distillation and the last one was that there was way less water, so I could actually pay attention to the temperature. The first drop showed up at around 70 C.
That's going
and then
pretty
it slowly
fast.
rose to 79 C, where it remained constant. This initial amount was called the foreshot, and
Oh
it
no, the
contained
video
almost
sped up. Never mind.
entirely low boiling point side products. In this section, if it were present, most of the methanol would come over, but I don't think that there was any here. This is because methanol is only produced when certain foods are fermented that contain sugars called pectins. I started with nearly pure cellulose though, so there was no real reason for any of it to be made. As I kept collecting it at 79C, it slowly got into the portion called the heads, which was mostly ethanol, but it still had some other stuff in it.
I've heard of
I
that
kept
before.
catching it
That
in the
term,
same
at
vial
least.
as the foreshot for a bit, and then I swapped it to a beaker to get the rest. As more came over, it slowly moved to the section called the hearts, which was almost pure ethanol. Along with the ethanol, though, usually comes some other things which actually taste good, and it makes this portion the most valuable. I was tracking everything, again by occasionally tasting it, and at this point, it was quite pure and probably around 85%.
Oh,
Like
nice.
before, though, there was still a lot of water in the boiling flask, and the amount of ethanol that was in it was constantly decreasing. So the stuff that I was collecting slowly got less concentrated, and the temperature also slowly increased. As this happened,
Look at
higher
that
boiling point side
when that
products were
drops
being
going. You
carried
can
over
see
with
like the little
ethanol,
swirlies
and it was
of
changing
alcohol.
the taste. This portion
Look
is
at
near
that.
the end of the distillation, and it's commonly known as the tails. However, I didn't ferment anything complex like fruit, so for this section, there weren't many side products that could come over. To me, the only thing that I noticed was that it was getting more dilute, and maybe a bit bitter. When making moonshine, distillers usually don't collect everything in one container, and
Right.
they try to separate the different sections. Both
Yeah,
the
I've heard
heads
about
and
that
the tails contain a lot of
from,
ethanol, but they often have a bunch of weird stuff mixed in, so
somewhere.
they're often just included in future runs. The hearts, like I said before, are the most valuable, and they contain the best tasting
From the
portion.
Moonshine show.
Knowing exactly when to start collecting the hearts and when to stop is one of the most important things when it comes to making a good quality product.
Right.
I, of course, wasn't making a typical moonshine though, and I felt that my ethanol
Yeah,
was a
we're
bit
making
too
TP
precious
moonshine.
to discard any of it. This was why I just chose to collect everything in one beaker. Also, like I said before, I was starting with a relatively pure sugar source, so there weren't that many side products that could be made. When it got to around 80 mils, the temperature was about 99C, and I didn't taste ethanol anymore, so I considered it done.
All right.
This was everything that was left in the boiling flask, and like all the other runs, I waited for it to cool, and then I got rid of it. The final result of this was 80 mils of an unknown concentration, and this little vial of the foreshot. I'm not sure how to describe it, but the foreshot really didn't smell very good, and I just threw it away.
Okay.
Now for the good part, I wanted to know how concentrated
That's
it was.
probably for the best.
Instead of just doing it with a hydrometer though, I again tried lighting it on fire. This time, it ignited really easily, and it burned with that big flame that's typical of ethanol.
Nice.
I was really happy that this worked, but it didn't really tell me much of anything about what the concentration actually was.
Still
to get
really
an
high,
accurate
though.
Number, again, I just had to use a hydrometer.
Does he have
The
enough
volume
to?
here was really low though, and my current
Yeah.
setup couldn't do it, so I had to buy a smaller one.
Oh, okay.
However, at first, this one also looked like it was still too big. When I looked at the bottom of it much closer though, I saw that it was actually floating.
Oh.
So, the reading on here should
Okay,
be fine,
so, you know,
and it told me that it was
60%.
about 64%. This was more or less
That's pretty
what I was
good.
expecting to get, and I felt that 64% was decent for a moonshine,
Yeah.
and I didn't have to distill it again. So at this point, it was pretty much done.
Hey,
and I poured
there
it
we
all into
go.
a little jar, and I labeled it appropriately. At 64% and about 78 mils, this was equivalent to 50 mils of pure ethanol, and like I said before, it was way more than I ever expected. I started with 100 grams of toilet paper, and assuming that 100% of that mass was turned into glucose, the maximum yield was about 60 mils. This meant that this whole process was 83% efficient, which to me was suspiciously good. This got me worried, that maybe the maltodextrin or the cornstarch that was added along with the enzyme was breaking down as well. Theoretically,
That could
cellulase
be.
doesn't attack either of these sugars, and yeast can't ferment them, but I had to make sure. So I ran a control by repeating the exact same process, and I just didn't include any toilet paper. When I distilled it all, I did actually get some ethanol, and my final yield was 20 mils of 20%.
Oh.
This meant that there were 5 mils of pure ethanol, and this likely came from the maltodextrin, which can sometimes have a small amount of fermentable sugar in it. So, it was contributing some ethanol, but pretty much all of it was still from the toilet paper. If 5 mils were coming from the enzyme though, then my real yield was 45 mils and not 50.
I mean,
and my
that's
actual
still...
efficiency was about 75%.
That's still really good.
In my opinion, this was still shockingly good, and even though I did everything myself, it's still kind of hard to believe that it all came from toilet paper. But anyway, now that I had actually made it, the only thing left to do was to see how it tasted.
I imagine it can't
While
be
I was
nice.
distilling it, I individually tasted each section, but
I mean, it is just like
into one. I was really
basically
curious
pure
to know what it was
ethanol.
like. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to smell it.
Well, not basically, but you know, the high concentration.
There's nothing gross about it, but also nothing really very special.
Imagine there won't
kind of
really be a
smells like
taste.
vodka, except with a bit of extra, maybe not good other stuff in there, which again, as I mentioned before, probably comes from either the heads or the tails, but it's not bad overall. And I guess I'll just taste it now.
All right.
I mean, it's really strong because it's 64%.
Yeah.
But it doesn't taste very bad. It's a little bit bitter,
Okay.
which I kind of got when I was tasting the tails when I was making it. Other than that, I don't know. I'm honestly not the best person to really review it because I don't.
It just
drink
burns
alcohol
like
often,
that.
and I honestly don't really like the taste of alcohol. But compared to vodkas and other stuff I've had in the past, this wasn't that much worse. There was, again, that little bit of
I
a bitter
imagine
taste,
there isn't
and
really
maybe
much
some off
there.
taste that came from the heads. But besides that, I mean, it wasn't too bad. If I were just served it, I would think that it's just generic alcohol, which I hate anyway. I'm not going to add that part.
Hey, I'd say that's a success.
But anyway, this about brings me to the end of this project. When I first came up with the idea for this, it was mostly just a funny concept, and I had no idea that it was actually going to work this well. I was honestly hoping for maybe 5 mils, and it's probably the first time ever that a project has turned out this much better than I expected.
Really?
Also, even
Things
though I'm
usually
really
go
not
a lot
fan of
more wrong.
alcohol, the flavor wasn't bad, and also, even though I'm really not a fan of alcohol, the flavor wasn't bad, and overall, I'm still shocked at how well it all turned out. For all the
Yeah.
alcohol that I still have left over, I would have loved to do a giveaway, but I doubt that
Yeah,
it would be
I
legal.
don't think you can do
So,
that.
I'm just going to be keeping it as a souvenir, and maybe I'll try to use it in a future video.
For
It took me a
what?
lot longer than I expected to put this all together, so my video schedule is a bit weird now, but I do plan to get another one out around mid-December. I don't want to give any details of what it's going to be about, but this next one is also a funny concept that I'd been working on for a while. It's also kind of
Which-
food-based too, so there will be some more tasting going on.
Okay.
Before I go, though,
Interesting.
I want to quickly mention
Oh, Team Trees, I remember
which
that.
I'm sure a lot of you guys have already heard about at this point. For those that haven't, though,
Yeah.
it's a tree planting initiative that was started by Mr. of their merch.
We can go ahead and
And the
skip.
goal is to get to 20 million.
Done already.
At the time of editing this, they're less than 5 million away.
Hey, and
if you
they
wanna
got there.
help,
They
you
got
can do
to
this by
21 million, I
donating
think.
or picking up some of their merch. And just as one last thing, I don't mention my other social media here very often, but I am also on Twitter and Instagram.
Right.
On both of these, I often post content that never makes it to YouTube, and sometimes I also share some high-quality stuff like this.
Okay. Oh. Liquid nitrogen egg. Wow.
As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on
Okay.
Patreon. Everyone who supports me can see my videos at least 24 hours before I post them to YouTube. Also, everyone on Patreon can directly message me, and if you support me with $5 or more, you'll get your name at the end like you see here.
Alright, thank you for watching. Make sure you go check out the original video, linked at the top of the description, and go subscribe to NileRed. He does a lot of cool stuff. And I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.